Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail is polarizing, and you all have a bunch of hot takes about it, and the state of Final Fantasy XIV. So in today's video, I'm going to react to your hot takes about this MMORPG. Hello everybody, I am Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming, and let's get right on into it with hot take number 1. Bear in mind, this is all for fun, and we're going to start off with @MarkV Sorelius7570, who says the thing about the Warrior of Light's power is that it's really not as big of a deal as we think. Is the Warrior of Light very strong? Yes, but remember, every single trial and raid fight we did with 7 other people, canonically. We fought Endsinger with 7 other people, plus the Scions and Xenos. We fought Emmett with 7 other people and the Scions. The only real 1v1 we've had across the entire series has been with Xenos and Endwalker. We are uber powerful, but we are not this unkillable god. Hell, even in the Arcadian raid story, Brood Bomber actively calls out the fact you needed to 8v1 him to win. Warrior of Light is not unstoppable. All you need to do is take away Asm's crystal and suddenly we're at a significant disadvantage, not to mention they could simply make the Echo less and less powerful the longer Hydaelyn is dead. The power thing is a non-issue. I agree to a point. I think when it concerns Final Fantasy XIV, I think a lot of people overall, and this isn't just Final Fantasy XIV, but a lot of people focus too much on like power scaling and stuff like that when it concerns media, instead of looking at the actual meat and potatoes of the story this power system is supposedly coming from to begin with. In Final Fantasy XIV, you have this whole concept of dynamis and all this, and the function of a system like that is to pretty much scale us to be as powerful as we need to be at a moment-to-moment basis. Combine that with the fact that we can call in other people to assist us, to make the raid possible. I think one of the conversations that surrounded Dawntrail was that we were so powerful, we were this giant demigod-esque entity hovering around the entire story going on, and the perception from that, and from the story up to this point, is that at any moment in time we could just step in and enact our will on any scene, and no one would be able to do anything to really stop us. I think the way that Square Enix wants the Warrior of Light to be handled is that we are powerful, we can absolutely have an effect if we choose to do so, but I also think they don't want us to necessarily be this giant eraser of an entity that can just go through the entire verse and delete whoever we want to, whenever we want to. We fought a couple of times in the main story, in sparring matches to be fair, against characters like Gululja, near the beginning of the story that a lot of people may not remember specifically, because it happened so early on, but it's not like we one-sidedly beat him down or anything like that. It was a fight. We are absolutely one of the strongest entities in the verse, and when needed to, we can utilize the power of Dynamis to overcome whatever challenge is placed in front of us alongside Asm's crystal. But I think it can be said that I'm not even sure if Square Enix knows necessarily how powerful they want the Warrior of Light to be. If they want to scale him back to some way or in some regard, or keep him as this giant powerful entity, I'm not sure if they necessarily even know, because Dawntrail is a bit wishy-washy when it comes to that idea. I think at the end of the day, their main goal is to tell what they believe to be a good story. And if they need the Warrior of Light to be stronger or weaker to achieve that, I think that's what they're going to do. In a lot of internet conversation surrounding, stuff like superhero movies or anime or video games, a lot of that conversation can boil down to some kind of power scaling argument, and I just don't think it's as big of a deal as some people make it out to be. But when it concerns Final Fantasy XIV, the thing with it to some degree is that you have to make it believable. You have to have threats that actually feel threatening and important to us, and not just like, it's like whatever. Like, if the main threat was a bandit leader, would we really be that invested in the story? Well, maybe depending upon how it's written, but in concept, not really, because we're way above that pay grade at this point. And if they want to write in whatever reason to maybe scale back the Warrior of Light to some degree, I wouldn't necessarily mind that. I'm not saying we go back to like level 1 or anything like that, but I wouldn't mind it if they want to scale us back somewhat, because I think you run into the Dragon Ball effect when you go on for too long and you believe the only way to raise the stakes is by making enemies more powerful, therefore requiring the main character to become ever more powerful as a direct result of that. There's numerous different series out there that kind of lose their way and their overall aesthetic when they go along that way of thinking. I'm not saying Dragon Ball has, even though, well, kind of did for me. Maybe that's my own hot take, but it happens all the time, where you start off small and you have this rock-solid aesthetic, and when you eventually become like God level, it no longer feels like what it used to be. And that can be good or bad, but it feels different. I don't know if they necessarily want it to be completely different here, because it's an MMORPG. You want it to feel like an adventure, you want it to feel like a journey, and in order to do that, the world needs to feel compelling, filled with things that can interact with us, that we can have an effect on them, but they can have an effect on us. And sure, no matter the constraint, you can write an interesting story. I think you just get way more options if you scale some things back. I don't want them to just go, okay, what's an even bigger threat than Emmett, the Endsinger? What's an even bigger threat than the Endsinger? The Endbringer, I don't know. I don't want them to continually do that. But I do think they have written the story in such a way where sometimes when we're giving analysis, we can put too much stock and too much emphasis on how powerful the Warrior of Light is, and we kind of ignore various examples the game is giving us, saying, hey, yeah, you are really powerful, but there are other entities that on any given day can give you a bit of a hassle. Let's move on to @EKR3L, who says, people say Final Fantasy XIV is FOMO free, FOMO being fear of missing out. Yet I keep seeing comments of people keeping their sub alive for years just for the housing system. The chokehold this system has on people is insane. And yeah, that was one of the things I've always heard about in regards to Final Fantasy XIV, is that compared to a lot of its competition, it is FOMO free. And I don't think that's the correct way to describe it, because there is some FOMO, namely with the housing system. I have an in-game house. I don't want to lose it. So even in periods of time where I'm not actively playing Final Fantasy XIV all that much, I still don't want to lose that house. I have one in Ishgard. It's a really nice house. It's only a small one, but I like it. And I think the housing system, when you actually have a house, is one of Final Fantasy XIV's greatest strengths, and it's just cool. It's a great bit of personalization and customization you can have in the game. It's a great little hangout spot for friends and stuff like that as well. It is a great system. It's not going to be for everybody, but for those who it appeals to, yeah, it is absolutely FOMO, because if you don't log in for a certain amount of time, unless they discontinue demolitions for whatever real-world reason, you can lose that plot, you can lose that house, and then it's a crap show trying to get another one back when you return because the lottery system. And there's never been a period in time in Final Fantasy XIV when I would describe housing acquisition as good, because they want it to be a community of thing. They want it to be a neighborhood. And I think that's a noble goal, but it makes acquisition in an MMORPG with as many players as Final Fantasy XIV has a real pain in the balls. You are not guaranteed to have a house. And even if you get a house, you're not guaranteed to get one where you would want it, preferably. So a lot of people have to settle. And yeah, that's crap. And the fear of returning to that system, having to interface with that system upon your return to get a house and then customize it all over again, yeah, that is FOMO. It's kind of an understandable FOMO, because with the housing acquisition being as crap as it is, if people just aren't playing the game, you would want to ideally open those plots up for those who are playing the game. But if those people come back, then for them, in that specific example, which I don't think is out of the realm of possibility, it is FOMO. I don't think there's a real easy answer outside of instance-based housing as a backup, but it's one of those things that's just inherently Final Fantasy XIV. And now we have @DanielGH9FV, who says, my hot take is that Endwalker is the second worst expansion under Stormblood. Smiley face. I cannot speak for Realm Reborn or Heavensward since I joined the game with Stormblood. I think I personally agree and disagree in different ways. If we're talking about expansions as a holistic experience, so story with content, and we're bearing both in mind as an overall experience, which expansions did I enjoy the most, I would probably go with Shadowbringers at my number 1, Stormblood at my number 2, this is the part where I kind of agree, Endwalker at number 3, and then Dawntrail at number 4. adore. I know a lot of people don't like the MSQ for Stormblood. I do, though. It's not perfect. I think Heavensward and Shadowbringers are better, a lot better, but I still enjoy it, and I love the patch content in Stormblood. I love the Evilise raids. I love the Omega raids. There's a lot of elements in Stormblood that I absolutely adore, and it does hold a place for me because that's when I joined the game. Shadowbringers was just playing all the time. I was fully engaged, more so than ever before with Final Fantasy XIV. Loved it to death. Endwalker, I absolutely adore the MSQ, but I didn't play that much of Endgame because the endgame that was on offer there just wasn't particularly appealing to me outside of a few tasks here and there. And then Dawntrail is the same at this point. Content issue that I had with Endwalker. Maybe down the line, and with things like 7.2, maybe this will change, but as of right now, I have the same issues that I had with Endwalker with Dawntrail, but also an MSQ that I didn't particularly enjoy that much. I thought it was okay, but not particularly enthralled by it, and I become increasingly soured on it as time goes on. So yeah, for me, Endwalker is my second least favorite expansion, but it's not under Stormblood, it's under Dawntrail, and I have Stormblood above it. And if we're talking about story overall, then for me the ranking would go Shadowbringers, Endwalker, Heavensward, Stormblood, A Realm Reborn, Dawntrail. That would be my order. In our penultimate take, we have @Ouch21, who says, I wouldn't be opposed to Dawntrail being reduced to a bad dream the Warrior of Light had. You wake up an old Sharlayan lying under a tree with Graha sitting by your side and Kryle standing before you, clearing her throat to get your attention. The next scene, you are telling them all about this crazy dream you had over lunch at the last stand, where Graha will be stuffing his face, causing both the Warrior of Light and Kryle to have a laugh, and then they roll the credits for the expansion. So this is your dream, Naruto. Ah yes, the Tsukuyomi out. I'm not opposed to it in some regards, but I don't think it's needed for Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail. I know a lot of people are down and out about the story for Final Fantasy XIV right now because of Dawntrail. Like I said, I think it's solely okay. In terms of Final Fantasy XIV standards, I would say, yeah, I think it's probably pretty bad. But it's a different kind of bad. For me, it's just kind of boring instead of retroactively recontextualizing elements of the story to make them way less appealing and recontextualizing a bunch of elements of the story that I once held dear and loved, and now soil them, irreparably so. I've been down this road before with other beloved IP that have done this to me, with Halo and World of Warcraft, where both of those IP, both of those series had entries that changed massive elements of the story and for specific characters that I loved a lot, and made them, in my opinion, trash and garbage. And I could go on, and I have before in regards to those two stories. When people tell me Dawntrail is bad, or Wuklamad is boring, or yaps too much, and they tell me Final Fantasy XIV is ruined or bad and stuff like that, I only think back to Halo and what stuff like Shadowlands and Battle for Azeroth did to the story there, and what Halo 5 did to the story of Halo. I've been down this road before. I have played these games before. When an IP that I grew up with made massive story pivots that were shockingly bad and made the entire story that came before worse because of their inclusion. For me, there isn't one story beat or plot point that does the same thing to Final Fantasy XIV for me. The entire Hydaelyn and Zodiac arc, I still hold in the highest regard. It is still uncompromised for me. I'm just of the opinion Dawntrail's kind of boring. Whoop-de-doo. When we move on to 8.0 or whatever, and we go to a new story, if that's good, no one will mind. Because Dawntrail doesn't inherently ruin anything that came before, just makes this moment right now a bit bleh. But it's not like they made a story choice where, say, yeah, you know Emmett Selk? Zoralja was actually controlling him behind the scenes all along. That's the level of idiocy I am accustomed to. Or like, imagine if Alice read a book and then became a villain and started killing everybody and wanted to enslave the entire world for no reason. This is the level of stupidity I'm accustomed to. This is what I mean when I say Dawntrail didn't do anything to ruin the story or the characters. They're just a bit bland right now. That's different. It's different in the same way eating bland food is different from eating actual poison. And there's some circumstances where I am of the opinion that I wouldn't mind it if stories did do that infinite Tsukuyomi excuse. And you say, look, this part of the story really sucks. Let's just take a knee, reset this, go back to basics. If it's bad enough, and you can write a good story from here on out, I'm okay with that. It is a cop-out, but sometimes the story is poisoned in such a way that you have to surgically remove it. I don't think Final Fantasy XIV is at that state. We have one final take for today's video, and it's a doozy. Buckle up. We have at Channel Raznov, who says MMO players treating their games like a job instead of a fun way to kill time is what ruined the genre. It's all about optimizing every little detail to save as much time as possible in a genre that's defined by wasting time with endless grinds. This is why dungeons are a hallway simulator instead of expansive areas to explore. It's why all of the classes are homogenized and brain dead easy to play at a base level. It's why the leveling experience is no longer a journey, but an afterthought. Older MMO players yearn for the olden days, but they're shouting right alongside everyone else the moment it takes a second longer to do a dungeon run. What made those early MMOs so special was the journey. It felt like a long adventure you went on with friends. Now it's, I need to get to Cap ASAP so I can get my BIS starting raid gear, so I can clear the raid the day it releases, then raid log for the next month or two till BIS, so I can spend the next few months complaining in the official forums about the lack of content. I've completely given up on the genre at this point. I'd rather play a single player game that I can relax and enjoy. Sorry for the rant, I'll take my old ass back outside the yellow clouds now, and I will pick up the torch and carry on this. For those who don't know, I've played MMOs for most of my life. The first MMO I started with was Old School RuneScape before it was called Old School RuneScape. I then moved on to World of Warcraft with Cataclysm, and then started Final Fantasy XIV with a little bit after the release of Stormblood. I have played MMOs for a long time. I love the genre, it's my favorite genre of games. This to me is a systemic problem plaguing a lot of the games that I at least play, and by that I mean I play two right now, World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV. Jmulls, doesn't that sound a bit hyperbolic? There's quite a few other games in the series. Yeah, but it sounds cool. But I think a direct comparison can be made with classic WoW, which is also something that I've started to dabble in relatively recently. And I think there is merit to the argument that I think a lot of the fun and the adventure and the journey of an MMO is being optimized out of the experience when it comes to, say, modern games like Final Fantasy XIV and World of Warcraft retail. And I've talked about retail World of Warcraft recently on this channel, so I'm going to focus in on Final Fantasy XIV right now. But I don't want it to come off as if these talking points I'm about to talk about only apply to Final Fantasy XIV. But I'm going to contextualize them within Final Fantasy XIV. There are elements and systems in this game that have been left in the actual dust. And I think the game is worse off because they haven't iterated on these core concepts from before. Things like the Fate system, just being this slog of content. Things like leaving guild hests in the past, alongside leave quests, not iterating on these systems. You don't just keep them the same as they were when they were first implemented, you iterate on these concepts over time. And this is something that I think a lot of MMOs don't do enough, and that's iteration. And they sanitize the experience, and it gets to a point of detriment, in my opinion. When Final Fantasy XIV, they try to preserve the journey through the main story. Okay, that's cool. I think Final Fantasy XIV, even in regards to Dawntrail, does a decent enough job of that, in terms of making the experience feel like a journey. The journey itself in Dawntrail was suspect, to say the least, for me, and polarizing, but it did feel like a journey. Then when you get to endgame, unless you're doing hunts, which are the most, like, on-rails experience because of how organized and optimized that system has become, the entire world essentially dies and doesn't have much use outside of go and do a few blue quests to unlock some stuff, and then you don't have to interact with the world ever again, or at least in a meaningful way or capacity. I think the Beast Tribe quest in Endwalker did a decent job somewhat, namely the cafe at the end of the universe in Ultimate Thor. That was like the standout for me. And then you have content like Ishgard Restoration, and that's cool, and we're going to get stuff like a new field operation or cosmic exploration, stuff like that. We're going to get that in Dawntrail. But there's so many elements of what I'm looking back on in terms of the journey that were there when I was first leveling in A Realm Reborn that the game just kind of no longer has. All in the name of optimization and simplification. And it's done so in the name of removing friction from the actual experience, which I think can work right? I don't think that's inherently a bad concept, and I think with MMOs especially, an issue that I always see brought up again and again, for me at least, are people viewing time slogs and uninteresting activities or just nuances of a specific game and viewing those things to be a virtue that they managed to overcome or deal with, and that somehow made the experience itself better. I don't inherently agree with that idea or that philosophy, but I also don't prescribe to the online thing where it has to be either or. I think it's a spectrum, and there's certain examples of things that should be called and certain examples of friction that has been smoothed away from the experience and makes the experience way less interesting and personal. I think in terms of Final Fantasy XIV, the way they've gone about doing this is by sticking to a rigid formula for the most part and rarely ever deviating from it, and when they do, they don't necessarily land on their feet. Stuff like island sanctuaries. Cool concept. Not that big of a fan of it though, but it leaves us with dungeons that feel extremely cookie cutter. Raids that are just largely boss rushes, and that's not inherently a bad thing, right? But again, variety is the spice of life here. And there will always be min-maxers, there will always be people that try to optimize the fun out of every experience, and it's a good developer's job to find a way to keep that experience alive, and not necessarily listen to every complaint that comes across your desk. I think one of the best examples for this is something I just brought up, the dungeon design in Final Fantasy XIV. I think the bosses are way better in Dawntrail than they have been recently. They are really good. But good God, does the dungeon system feel as if it just needs an overhaul. It's all so formulaic and every dungeon just feels the same. It lacks variety, it lacks the spice of life, it lacks the feeling of being an adventure or a dungeon because it all just feels so sanitized and gamified. They don't feel like natural locations I'm exploring in this world. They just feel like instance pieces of content I'm supposed to work my way through in a manner that has been broken down and planned out so meticulously. And I think the journey, the adventure in an MMORPG can be extremely hard to preserve for years and years, but it's important to try to do so. And I think Final Fantasy XIV tries to preserve it in its own ways, but it fails to do so in others. And I've talked about this problem before with Final Fantasy XIV. When I made those videos talking about what Final Fantasy XIV can learn from WoW and what WoW can learn from Final Fantasy XIV, far too often do I think Final Fantasy XIV plays it too safe, elects not to take enough risks or risks that are systemic and seismic enough. And it leads to an experience that at the time when you're first experiencing it can feel fresh and new, but when you're constantly experiencing it over time, as the years and years go by, it's going to lose that initial luster and shine that it once had and now feel stale and repetitive. You can be served the most delicious meal of your life, but if it's the only thing you ever eat, and it's an MMORPG, these games inherently are designed for you to put in a lot of hours and to have a lot of investment in with them. If it's the only thing you ever really eat, it will feel stale over time. The experience needs to evolve and change and to feel like an adventure and not be eroded and sanded away with time. And the way this happens to a lot of modern games, especially long-running games, is different on a case-by-case basis. And I think the way it's happened with Final Fantasy XIV is that they refuse to, over multiple expansions, really iterate on important systems. And too many in the past have been languished to the sands of time without taking them into the future. Funnily enough, one of the best examples of them not doing this is stuff like field operations, going from Eureka to Bosja and then going to whatever we're going to get with Dawntrail. That's an idea of a system that is being brought over multiple expansions. I want more systems to feel like that, but also I want new stuff to make the experience feel fresh and new. I want a reason to be out in the world, to live it and experience it, because you spend so much time trying to craft this beautiful and majestic world with the main story, and then when that story is over, I rarely have ever reason to actually go out there and do anything there, unless you give me like a Beast Tribe quest that I have to go and do 3 filler quests every day to grind up some rep. And I'm sorry, but I don't like the one in Dawntrail right now with the Pelu Pelu. I think it's freaking boring. So while I don't inherently agree with the idea that old MMOs are strictly better than modern ones, and I don't agree or like the idea that any friction is good friction, I also don't think you want something that's completely smooth. You need to have some texture, you need to have friction, but it needs to be the right friction. That's what makes great games different from good games. And I do think it's a hard conversation without a particular easy answer. So here's where you come in. 1, so I can make another one of these videos, leave a comment down below with your own hot take about Final Fantasy XIV, past, present, and future. I'd love to hear your thoughts, hear your opinions, hear your perspectives. But also, let me know of a system that existed in Final Fantasy XIV in the past that you would like to see brought back into the future, or that you wish never left, that maybe added that texture but in a good way, or a way that maybe wasn't the best when it was implemented in the game, but with a few key changes could be really good now. I would like to see some customization in terms of job design for Final Fantasy XIV. I think they're a bit too stagnant and just impersonal. Sure, the internet will min-max everything to non-existence, but that'll happen to anything. And it's still cool to be able to have some say in how I play. I'd love to hear your thoughts though, hear your opinions and hear your perspectives. Stay safe. If you liked the video, please leave a like and subscribe. It'd really help the channel out and help support future content, and I greatly appreciate it. Stay safe, have a great day, go play some video games, dream big, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye everybody, until we meet again.